All right, welcome back to the channel, man. DC, where you at? That's what's up. Gary Russell Jr. gets back on Fight Hype and calls out Terence Crawford again. Tells Terence Crawford, man, Al Heyman and Gary Russell Jr. reached out to Top Rank with Crawford and have not heard back yet. Dog, why don't you just fight him, Terence? Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So, look, this is one of the most fun topics in boxing right now. Terence Crawford and who he's going to fight next. And will he fight somebody from the PBC? It's just an absolutely wonderful discussion because it involves so many terrific fighters. Terence Crawford is the #1 pound for pound fighter in the world, in my book. Don't let anything that I say, or any, which are facts, by the way, though, not making this stuff is pretty much facts. There ain't no way around it. But don't get it twisted. I really do like Terence Crawford. I think he's a great fighter. But he's just not looking that good right now, man. Gary Russell Jr., who is the WBC 126-pound champion, longest reigning champion in boxing, except for, unless Wolf Midlothian came out of retirement, and I'm not sure. So he's the first or second longest reigning champion in boxing at 126 with the WBC belt. And he calls out Terence Crawford for a fight at 147 because he can't get a fight at 126 pounds. We all heard the drama around it, which was, it's funny stuff, man. It's Gary Russell Jr. says he punched Terence Crawford in the jaw, broke his jaw. Then they had a bunch of back and forth about it, right? Terence Crawford responded to him about that, right? Responded to him about that and all of that, which is, it's between them, neither here nor there, really. Other than you would think if somebody went off like that they, would actually want to make a fight, But Terence Crawford doesn't want the fight because Terence Crawford says that Gary Russell Jr. is too small. But Gary Russell Jr. obviously is serious about the fight, and he says, dude, don't nobody want to see you fight any more bums. Now that's not me. It's not me calling people bums, okay? I'm not doing that. But that's what Gary Russell Jr. said. Gary Russell Jr. said, look, man, nobody want to see you fight these bums. If you're not going to fight Keith Thurman, or if you're not going to fight, what did he say, Keith Thurman or Sean Porter, then who else you going to fight? You ain't got nobody to fight. You might as well fight me. Sorry for the interruption, man. I got something in my throat. Had to get a drink of water. So anyway, look, Terence Crawford says he doesn't want to fight him. Gary Russell Jr. sent him, I don't know if he sent him an offer or not, or whether they just reached out and said, hey, let's talk about this fight. But they said these guys didn't even, Top Rank and Crawford didn't even respond. And it's just makes Terence Crawford look like he doesn't want to fight anybody other than Errol Spence Jr. and Errol Spence Jr. and Manny Pacquiao. While Errol Spence Jr. fights guys like Sean Porter, Mikey Garcia, now he's fighting Danny Garcia right off that car accident. Terence Crawford it just seems like he is set on fighting low risk guys until he gets the big pay-per-view fight against either Manny Pacquiao or Errol Spence Jr. Otherwise, he's not going to take any risks. But Gary Russell Jr. also makes a good point in that regard. Even if he's going to take that, even if that's what he's going to do, and that's what I'm believing that he's doing. He might as well fight somebody like a Gary Russell Jr., right? Because somebody might actually be interested in the fight. Because if he doesn't do something to create more interest in the fights and at least alleviate, I don't know if fighting Gary Russell Jr. is going to alleviate people saying that he won't fight, elite welterweights, because clearly it's not an elite welterweight, right? So fighting Gary, I could understand from his perspective how Gary Russell Jr. does not, serve that purpose for Terence Crawford, but neither do any of the other welterweights out there that he could fight. Kell Brook, to a certain extent, but Kell Brook still is a situation where you're just kind of settling for it. You know what I mean? But it is what it is. Obviously, the fight is not going to take place, man. But it really is. I mean, it's just terribly unfortunate, man. At least Guillermo Rigondeaux got an opportunity to fight Vasily Lomachenko, and the good thing that came out of that is that Guillermo Rigondeaux got more exposure. His name got out there, even though it got out there in a way where, he wound up losing to Vasily Lomachenko. It's still, there was enough, public support out there for Guillermo Rigondeaux that he was able to parlay that into a contract with the PBC that seems to be doing real well. It's also nice to see, as a side note to this, that Gary Russell Jr. is working with Al Haymon, because originally, man, people were telling me that Gary Russell Jr., just fights on a contract by contract basis. And, so he'll negotiate a fight with himself and somebody that Al Haymon wants him to fight. But to see Al Haymon work with Gary Russell Jr., to get a fight that's outside the PBC, man, I think that dispels that, man, a little bit, man. But, it's just unfortunate, man. And the losers in these situations are both Gary Russell Jr. and Terence Crawford if this fight doesn't get made. Gary Russell Jr., by not being able to fight Terence Crawford, is going to be, at 126 with a bunch of people that act like he doesn't exist. You know what I'm saying? Because they wish he didn't exist, because they don't have the ability to beat him, man. And, so a guy with the talent of Gary Russell Jr., that's why I think people should really ask for the fight. Ask for the fight. It's a good fight to be made for that reason, if not that reason alone, but definitely for that reason. There's a lot of people in boxing that say they're moving up weight classes, to get glory, right? So Manny Pacquiao moves up, and somebody can say, I know somebody's going to say, well, somebody did it all at one time. What difference does it make? If Manny Pacquiao has the right to move up several weight classes, and Vasily Lomachenko has the right to move up, from 126 to 130 to 135. If Guillermo Rigondeaux can go from basically 118, because he's a 118 fighter who was fighting at 122, but he moved up basically from his natural weight, which is 118, to 122, past 122, all the way up to 130. Bob Foster moved up and fought guys, 30 pounds bigger than him. Deontay Wilder, at heavyweight, by the way, fought a guy that was 50 pounds bigger than him. Why shouldn't Gary Russell Jr., who's he's not undefeated, excuse me, don't want to do an ESPN, who has one loss to a guy that many people believe is the number one pound for pound fighter in the world, right? I think ESPN, I don't know if they have Canelo Alvarez or Vasily Lomachenko as number one. But anyway, some people have Vasily Lomachenko as number one pound for pound. And I do believe that was a split decision. That was a split decision win. Either somebody had the fight for Gary Russell Jr. or somebody had it a draw for Gary Russell Jr. But Vasily Lomachenko didn't win that on all those cards. And revisionist history aside, that was not some crazy blowout for Vasily Lomachenko, dude. Vasily Lomachenko didn't look nearly as dominant against Gary Russell Jr. as he did against other people not named Orlando Salido. And so that should be held to the credit of Gary Russell Jr. But if people act like, it's some joke, like, why wouldn't you allow a guy like that to be able to move up and be serious about fighting somebody weight classes above. It's not against the rules. People are oftentimes are talking about other people trying to set records. If he wants to say, "Hey man, I want to set a record," well, I'm sorry, you can't do it because you don't make enough money for us in order to set records. The records are for fighters that we want to promote. That's pretty much the message that I get out of that from the treatment of Gary Russell, from the treatment of Gary Russell Jr. Because there's no other reason why he shouldn't be able to go up there and fight. And Terence Crawford is doing him and on the Terence Crawford side, right now he's in a catch-22, right? Like he can say that if I fought him, if he fought him, he's in a catch-22, right? Where it's lose-lose for him, because if he beats him, he's supposed to. If he doesn't beat him, then or doesn't dominate him and run through him, then he looks bad, right? So he doesn't want to be in that in that lose-lose situation. But welcome to reality. He's already in that situation because right now, Gary Russell Jr.'s put him in that situation because he's either going to fight him, and if he fights him, he fights him, and if people are going to criticize, they're going to criticize. If he doesn't fight him, people are going to criticize because there's no reason he shouldn't fight him, especially considering the level of opposition and the people that the other options he has to fight, which is nobody. You know what I mean? If it's not Keith Thurman and it's not Sean Porter. Incidentally, people that Terence Crawford also said he wouldn't fight. So, the whole situation is really funky and funny. But thanks you very much for talking about it with me. Let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.